18:45 hours on January 28, 1978. Driver John Fairweather eased the throttle forward on the Inverness to Wick passenger service, pulling 6 carriages and 214 souls into what meteorologists were calling a routine Highland snowfall. Standard procedure said wait for the ploughs, check with the signalmen, delay until conditions improved. Fairweather had cleared this line for 23 years. He knew every gradient, every curve, every signal box between Inverness and the Caithness coast. The evening service was already 2 hours late. Passengers needed to get home. The snow would clear. He was wrong. In the next 52 hours, that train would vanish into a whiteout so complete that rescue helicopters would fly within 200 metres and see nothing. Passengers would survive sub-zero temperatures in dead carriages. RAF Mountain. Rescue would dig through drifts tall enough to bury a 2-storey house, and Switzerland would send its most powerful snow-clearing machine to cut a path through what became Scotland's worst transport disaster of the decade. This is the story of the train that got lost 40 kilometres from home. The storm arrived from the north, not the typical Atlantic low-pressure system that brings wet snow and wind to the Scottish Highlands. This was Arctic air, bone-dry and murderously cold, funneling down through the Pentland Firth and accelerating across the flat expanses of Caithness. By the time it hit the high ground south of Wick, wind speeds exceeded 70 knots, temperature -15 Celsius, visibility 0. Fairweather felt the train shudder as they passed Clachnahary, just north of Inverness. The wind hit broadside, rocking the carriages on their springs. Snow streaked horizontally across the cab windows, so thick he could barely see the signals. Behind him, 214 passengers settled in for a cold journey. Students heading back to university in Aberdeen, oil workers rotating off the rigs, families visiting relatives. The heating worked, the lights worked. Most expected to reach Wick by 2200 hours, 3 hours late but safe. They had no idea the railway line had already disappeared under snow. The first sign of trouble came at Lentran, 12 kilometres north of Inverness. The train slowed to a crawl. Fairweather couldn't see the track ahead. The headlamp beam diffused into a wall of white. He was navigating by feel now, reading the gradients through the locomotive's pitch, guessing at curves he'd driven 1,000 times. His fireman, Donald MacLeod, 31 years old and new to the Highland routes, pressed his face against the side window. Nothing. Just wind-driven snow hammering the glass like sand. "We should turn back," MacLeod said. Fairweather shook his head. They were committed now. Reversing a 6-carriage train through a blizzard with no visibility was more dangerous than pushing forward. Wick was 48 kilometres away. The signals were still green. Someone at the control centre knew where they were, except no one did. At 19:23 hours, the train passed through Bowley without stopping. The station was unmanned, the platform buried under half a metre of fresh snow. Fairweather eased the speed down to 30 kilometres per hour, then 20, then 15. The wind was doing something strange. Instead of blowing consistently from one direction, it swirled and eddied, creating drifts in random patterns. Some sections of track were almost clear. Others had accumulated snow chest-deep in minutes. At 19:57 hours, the train hit the first drift. The locomotive punched through, throwing a spray of snow higher than the telegraph poles. The first carriage followed. The second carriage slowed. The third carriage stopped. Fairweather felt the wheels lose traction. The engine roared, spinning uselessly against packed snow. He cut the throttle, waited, tried again. Nothing. They were stuck. MacLeod climbed down from the cab to assess the situation. He sank to his waist immediately. The drift extended at least 30 metres ahead, packed solid by 70-knot winds. He could barely stand upright in the blast. After 2 minutes, he gave up and climbed back inside, his face already showing early frostbite. "We're not getting through that," he said. Fairweather radioed the control centre at Inverness. Static. He tried again. More static. The storm was killing radio communications across the entire Highlands. In the passenger carriages, people began to realise something was wrong. Margaret Thompson, a nurse from Thurso travelling home from a training course in Glasgow, noticed the heating vents had gone cold. The train had been stationary for 15 minutes. Outside, she could see nothing but darkness and horizontal snow. A guard worked his way through the carriages trying to project calm. Temporary delay. Waiting for a plough. Should be moving soon. No one believed him. By 2100 hours, the temperature inside the carriages had dropped to 5 degrees Celsius. Passengers wrapped themselves in coats and blankets. Some shared body heat, huddling together in groups. The emergency lighting provided just enough illumination to see shadows. Fairweather tried the radio again. This time he got through to Inverness, but the signal was breaking up. He managed to convey their approximate position, somewhere between Bowley and Muir of Ord, stuck in a drift, heating, failing, 214 people on board. The controller asked if they could reverse to Bowley station. Fairweather looked out the rear of the cab. The tracks behind them had vanished under fresh snow. In zero visibility, reversing blind through drifts with no radio guidance would be suicide. "Negative," he said. "We hold position and wait for rescue." That's when the locomotive lost power. Not all at once. First the lights dimmed, then the heating cut out completely. Then the electrical systems began shutting down one by one as the batteries drained. By 2300 hours, the entire train sat dark and cold, in the middle of a blizzard, with wind chill driving the effective temperature to minus 30 Celsius. In Carriage 3, Margaret Thompson organised the passengers into survival groups. Medical training had taught her about hypothermia. She knew they had maybe 12 hours before people started dying. She moved through the carriage, assessing who was most vulnerable: elderly passengers, children, anyone wet from attempting to leave the train. She grouped them in the centre of the carriage, surrounded by younger, healthier passengers who could share body heat. Someone found a guitar. A student from Aberdeen played folk songs for 2 hours straight, keeping people awake, keeping them moving, keeping them alive. Outside, the storm intensified. By midnight, the train had completely disappeared under snow. Drifts reached 6 metres high on the windward side, burying entire carriages. The wind carved the snow into strange shapes, creating hollows and peaks that shifted minute by minute. At Inverness Control Centre, officials faced a nightmare scenario. They had a train full of passengers somewhere on a 48-kilometre stretch of line. No radio contact, no visual confirmation, and a storm that had shut down every road north of the Moray Firth. They called RAF Lossiemouth. Flight Lieutenant James Crawford was preparing for bed when the scramble order came through. He was the senior search and rescue pilot at Lossiemouth, veteran of 37 rescue operations in Highland conditions. He'd pulled climbers off Ben Nevis in force 9 gales. He'd lifted fishermen from sinking boats in 50-metre seas, but he'd never tried to find a train in a whiteout. The briefing was brutally simple. 214 people trapped somewhere between Bowley and Muir of Ord. No communication, heating failed. Time critical. The problem: cloud base at 50 feet, visibility 0, winds gusting to 70 knots. Flying conditions that grounded everything except desperate rescue attempts. Crawford's Westland Sea King helicopter lifted off at 0130 hours on January 29th. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Michael Hartley, fought the controls as they climbed into thick cloud. The helicopter bucked and yawed in the turbulence. Inside the cabin, 2 RAF mountain rescue specialists hung onto grab handles, their faces grim. They flew the railway line at 100 feet, sometimes 50, the searchlight cutting a cone of white through the blizzard. Crawford could see nothing. The ground was invisible. The railway was invisible. They were navigating by GPS coordinates and prayer, searching for a train that might have been buried under snow 20 metres deep. After 40 minutes, they gave up and returned to Lossiemouth. "It's impossible," Crawford told the base commander. "We could fly right over them and never see them." On the train, the first night was the worst. Temperature inside the carriages dropped to minus 8 Celsius. Frost formed on the windows, on the walls, on anything metal. Passengers' breath created clouds that hung in the still air. Some people had lost feeling in their fingers and toes. Margaret Thompson kept moving through the carriages, checking for signs of severe hypothermia, confusion, slurred speech, loss of consciousness. She found 3 elderly passengers showing symptoms and moved them into her central survival group, wrapping them in every spare piece of clothing she could find. A businessman from Edinburgh had a flask of whiskey. He wanted to drink it to stay warm. Thompson stopped him. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, increases heat loss. It would kill him faster. She took the flask and used tiny amounts to warm the mouths of hypothermia victims, just enough to get blood flowing. At 0400 hours, a child started crying. 4 years old, travelling with his mother, too cold to sleep. His mother held him close, singing softly, rocking him. Others joined in. Hymns, lullabies, anything to maintain morale. Fairweather and MacLeod stayed in the locomotive cab, trying to restart the auxiliary power. The batteries were dead. The main engine wouldn't turn over. They had hand torches and one thermal blanket between them. "How long can they last back there?" MacLeod asked. Fairweather didn't answer. He'd worked Highland Railways long enough to know what -30 wind chill does to a human body. 24 hours in these conditions? Maybe. 48? They'd be pulling corpses from the carriages. Dawn brought no relief. The sun rose somewhere above the storm clouds, turning the whiteout from black to grey. Visibility improved to perhaps 10 metres, still useless for visual searching. At Inverness, officials were coordinating the largest rescue operation in Scottish history. RAF mountain rescue teams were attempting to reach the train by road, but the A9 highway had disappeared under drifts measuring 20 feet deep. Lorries sat buried with only their cab roofs visible. Snowplows broke down trying to cut through. Someone suggested bringing in specialised equipment. Switzerland had developed rotary snowblowers capable of cutting through drifts no British machine could touch. These massive devices could clear 6-metre drifts at walking pace, throwing snow in arcs 30 metres high. At 0900 hours, British Rail contacted Swiss Federal Railways. Could they loan a rotary blower? How fast could it get to Scotland? The Swiss agreed. The machine would arrive by air transport within 24 hours. 24 hours? The passengers didn't have 24 hours. On the train, people were beginning to fade. An elderly man in carriage 5 had stopped responding. His skin was grey, his breathing shallow. Margaret Thompson worked her way through the packed carriage and checked his pulse. Faint. 40 beats per minute. Severe hypothermia. He needed a hospital immediately. She had nothing. No medical equipment, no heat source, no way to get him out. She wrapped him in her own coat, surrounded him with warm bodies, and prayed. At 1000 hours, the RAF tried again. Crawford took a different approach this time. Instead of searching the entire railway line, he focused on the most likely section, the exposed high ground between Bowley and Muir of Ord where drifts would form fastest. He flew a grid pattern, 50 metres apart, searchlight sweeping. His observer spotted something at 10:37 hours, not the train. A shadow in the snow, a depression that didn't match the natural drift patterns. Crawford circled, descended to 30 feet, rotors kicking up a storm of snow. There, a dark shape. Could be a carriage roof. Could be a shed. Could be nothing. He marked the GPS coordinates and radioed Inverness. Possible contact, sending ground team. Getting a ground team to that location took 3 hours. RAF mountain rescue specialists drove as close as they could in tracked vehicles, then set out on skis pulling emergency supplies. The drift field was treacherous. Snow had packed into waves and ridges that concealed crevasses and hollow spots where a man could fall through to his chest. They found the train at 13:45 hours. Or rather, they found the top 15 centimetres of carriage 6, barely visible above the snow. The rest of the train sat entombed under drifts measuring 6 metres deep at the deepest point. Team leader Sergeant Alan McBride radioed the situation back to base. Train confirmed, partially derailed, completely buried, no visible signs of life. They started digging. Digging through 6 metres of wind-packed snow with hand tools is brutal work. The snow had compressed into something close to ice, requiring picks and shovels to break through. 5 men working in shifts could clear perhaps 2 metres per hour. At this rate, they'd reach the passenger carriages in 12 hours. McBride made a decision. They'd dig straight down to the nearest carriage window, punch through, get warm air and supplies inside, then continue clearing around the train for full evacuation. At 14:20 hours, they punched through to carriage 3. The window shattered inward. Warm air rushed up through the hole. Then a face appeared. Margaret Thompson, frostbitten and exhausted, staring up at the circle of sky. "We're here!" McBride shouted down. "Hang on, we're getting you out." Thompson's response was pure Highland stoicism. "About bloody time." The evacuation took 9 hours. Mountain rescue teams widened the access hole, dropped thermal blankets and hot soup down to the passengers, then began the slow process of hauling people up one by one. The elderly first, the children, the hypothermia cases. Each person had to be lifted 6 meters vertically through the snow shaft using rope harnesses. By 2300 hours on January 29th, 193 passengers had been lifted out and transferred to heated vehicles for transport to hospital. 21 people remained on the train, too weak to be moved safely in darkness. Crawford's helicopter attempted an overnight rescue, but was driven back by renewed snowfall and zero visibility. The final evacuations happened at dawn on January 30th. Crawford brought his Sea King in low, hovering while his crew lowered a rescue basket. One by one, the last passengers came up. The elderly man from carriage 5, barely alive. A woman with severe frostbite who would lose 3 toes. The guard who'd maintained morale for 52 hours straight. Fairweather and MacLeod came out last, at 08:15 hours. Fairweather refused the rescue basket initially. He wanted to stay with his locomotive. McBride had to order him into the harness. As the helicopter climbed away, Fairweather looked down at his train. 6 carriages barely visible beneath tons of snow. He'd driven that route 500 times, he knew every kilometre, and the storm had still beaten him. The final toll, 0 deaths, 47 cases of frostbite, 12 cases of severe hypothermia requiring hospitalisation, 214 survivors. It could have been catastrophic. It should have been. But a combination of professional crew response, passenger cooperation, and one nurse who knew how to keep people alive in sub-zero conditions had prevented disaster. The Swiss rotary snowblower arrived 3 days later. It took 2 days to clear the line. The train was dug out, repaired, and returned to service 6 weeks later. Fairweather drove it again, 1 year to the day after the incident. Same route, same time, different weather. The Highland mainline still runs from Inverness to Wick, 161 kilometres of some of Scotland's most exposed railway. Modern weather forecasting means no passenger service runs into conditions like January 1978, but the infrastructure hasn't changed much. The wind still howls across Caithness. The snow still drifts 6 metres deep in the wrong conditions, and somewhere in the archives at RAF Lossiemouth there's a flight log entry from Flight Lieutenant James Crawford, dated January 29, 1978. Mission: Search and Rescue, Railway Incident. Conditions: Marginal VARS-FR, Severe Turbulence, Zero Visibility. Outcome: Success. Notes: Never again.